The strategic countdown within the Persian Gulf has reached a critical threshold as the regional silence grows increasingly heavy with the weight of impending kinetic confrontation. Tehran initiated a high-stakes provocation this past Tuesday by launching a Shahed loitering munition on a direct collision course toward American naval strike assets. This specific class of kamikaze drone has already demonstrated its devastating lethality by systematically dismantling critical national infrastructure across the battlefields of Eastern Europe. An American F-35 Lightning II responded with clinical precision, utilizing advanced sensor fusion to eliminate the aerial surveillance threat before it could compromise the fleet. While military officials cannot confirm if the intercepted drone carried a live warhead, the strategic message delivered by the Islamic Republic was undeniably kinetic. Simultaneous to this high-altitude duel, Iranian naval forces accelerated their campaign of aggression against vital commercial shipping lanes located within the narrow maritime corridors. Two fast-attack gunboats performed an aggressive flanking maneuver against the Stena Imperative, a critical chemical tanker navigating under the protection of the American flag. The Iranian crews issued a formal demand for the vessel to halt for immediate boarding, representing a direct challenge to international maritime sovereignty. The USS McFall intervened with overwhelming speed, scattering the Iranian maritime forces and establishing a secure corridor for the tanker's continued safe passage. These isolated tactical skirmishes serve as a violent overture to a much higher-stakes diplomatic opera scheduled to take place this coming Friday. While diplomats engage in performative bickering over the choice of venue, the Pentagon has quietly and decisively shifted the entire geopolitical chessboard. The White House has successfully coordinated a massive concentration of strike power, positioning a terrifying arsenal directly upon the Islamic Republic's front doorstep. The global community is now witnessing the decisive moment where Washington must finally choose between the comfort of performative deterrence and the necessity of action. Current public discourse is rapidly drowning in a sea of toxic misconceptions regarding the actual strategic intent held by the current American administration. Many regional analysts dismiss this deployment as another theatrical bluff from the Trump administration, claiming the maneuvers lack the substance of true military resolve. Other observers are drawing confused lines connecting these specific naval maneuvers to the stalled nuclear negotiations, failing to see the broader hard power dynamics. Analysts must now cut through the superficial media noise to investigate the cold, hard power dynamics that are currently dictating the pace of this escalation. This assessment is not interested in the tactical minutiae of individual radar locks or specific engagement envelopes that define modern naval warfare. The primary focus remains strictly on the political utility of this massive force projection and the immense leverage it grants to American negotiators. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has officially arrived at its station, parking itself well within the optimal striking distance of the Iranian capital. This massive floating fortress brings an unprecedented amount of aerial firepower, reinforced by a lethal escort of 3 advanced guided missile destroyers. The presence of the USS McFall, alongside other surface combatants, has pushed the regional naval presence past the threshold of critical mass. These destroyers are undoubtedly armed to capacity with Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, standing in a state of high readiness for immediate launch orders. Command elements within the Indo-Pacific theater are likely viewing this diversion of assets with extreme concern as resources move away from the China theater. European allies are expressing similar anxieties as they watch precious munitions and logistical support drift away from the ongoing crisis on the Russian front. This is the brutal reality of 2026, where every global theater must compete for a shrinking pool of high-tech munitions and strategic military resources. Beyond the visible naval fleet, the United States Air Force has forward-deployed wings of F-15E Strike Eagles into heavily fortified Jordanian air bases. The heavy logistical footprint of this operation is becoming visible in Qatar, where aerial tankers and advanced air defense batteries are digging into position. High-altitude surveillance assets are currently sweeping the entire electronic spectrum, while search and rescue teams remain pre-positioned for immediate pilot recovery missions. Intelligence reports suggest that additional Patriot missile batteries are arriving in the region to shield regional allies from the threat of ballistic retaliation. It is essential to understand that this current posture is not a prelude to a massive ground invasion of the Iranian mainland. Observers see zero evidence of the massive troop buildup or logistical staging required for a 2003-style regime change operation within the region. Such a massive mobilization would be impossible to conceal in an era defined by ubiquitous commercial satellite imagery and open-source intelligence. Instead, the current American posture mirrors the strategic squeeze recently applied during the high-stakes naval operations conducted near the Venezuelan coast. That previous deployment involved significant amounts of hardware, proving that the administration was fully willing to back its diplomatic threats with cold steel. The White House is signaling a similar level of lethal seriousness regarding the Iranian regime's continued destabilizing behavior across the Middle East. However, The international community must acknowledge the immense financial and strategic opportunity cost associated with these massive carrier movements. Pulling the USS Abraham Lincoln from its Pacific station leaves a dangerous security vacuum near the Taiwan Strait during a period of high tension. Beijing has been testing Taiwanese defenses with record-breaking levels of aerial and naval aggression throughout the course of the recent weeks. The administration is gambling on the hope that it can manage a crisis in the Gulf without losing critical ground in the Pacific theater. A major misunderstanding persists regarding the lack of direct American intervention during the massive Iranian domestic protests that occurred weeks ago. The general public assumed that the Pentagon could simply teleport precision munitions onto targets the moment internal unrest reached its peak. While B-2 Spirit bombers possess global reach, the execution of a sustained air campaign requires incredibly complex theater, logistics, and local support. At the height of the Iranian uprising, many critical U.S. strike assets were tied down in the South American theater of operations. The specific tools required to support the protesters with kinetic strikes simply were not in a physical position to be utilized effectively. Inaction during that window was primarily a matter of logistical limitations rather than a fundamental lack of political will from the White House. Therefore, past restraint shown by the United States should not be interpreted as a reliable predictor of future hesitation in the current crisis. Social media analysts frequently claim that Iran is now a clear target, reversing their previous skepticism with alarming and unearned confidence. Only 2 weeks ago, the prevailing digital algorithms were convinced an invasion of Greenland was imminent, illustrating the inherent folly of crowdsourced analysis. Intelligent strategic analysis ignores the political rhetoric and instead tracks the movement of heavy metal and logistics across the global map. While the media obsessed over headlines about Greenland, the commander-in-chief was quietly moving actual heavy iron into the Persian Gulf. We advised strategic patience during the previous news cycle, but the current escalation with Iran demands immediate and urgent attention. Kinetic conflict is not yet guaranteed, but the administration is clearly positioning its assets to deliver a decisive knockout blow. Unless Tehran offers immediate and substantial concessions, the statistical probability of a lethal engagement is rising with every passing hour. Two divergent analytical frameworks currently exist to explain where this rapid escalation is heading next. The first perspective argues that diplomatic credibility is dead, suggesting that Washington missed a critical window to strike during the unrest. Had American air power been available when protesters outnumbered police, the regime's leadership structure might have collapsed under the pressure. But that opportunity was lost because vital naval assets were occupied circling Venezuela, proving that global logistics dictates destiny. Bombing the regime now, without the force multiplier of active street unrest, serves little purpose other than spiking global oil prices. Yet, a sophisticated alternative involves strangling the regime's economic lifeline via a strict maritime quarantine rather than explosive strikes. We must distinguish between a quarantine and a blockade, as the latter is a formal act of war under international law. Senate hawks have been specific about this legal distinction, aiming to bankrupt the central government and sever the IRGC's paychecks. The primary external target of this pressure campaign is actually the People's Republic of China, Tehran's last remaining economic patron. By physically cutting the oil supply, Washington hopes to force Beijing to leverage its massive influence over the Iranian leadership. The downside is a guaranteed shock to the global energy market, displacing demand and driving up the price per barrel domestically. There is also the distinct risk that Tehran escalates beyond harassment, attempting to shut down the Strait of Hormuz entirely. We have analyzed this strait closure scenario extensively, and it represents a lose-lose nightmare for the global economy. While tactically difficult for Iran to sustain, such a move would force the U.S. Navy to prove its dominance in a chaotic environment. The second analytical perspective argues that stability is preferred, and Washington seeks a temporary bargain to avoid a wider war. The current diplomatic buzz focuses exclusively on the nuclear file, isolating the atomic threat from the recent domestic protests. The fact that negotiations are happening at all proves that significant nuclear assets survived the airstrikes conducted last June. Tehran likely retains enough highly enriched uranium to remain a threshold nuclear state, leveraging a future bomb to guarantee survival. Right now, Washington enjoys a spike in bargaining power derived from the lingering threat of domestic instability within Iran. The core problem with negotiating during a power shift is the commitment problem. A rising state has no incentive to honor weak promises. The deal on the table is straightforward. The U.S. refrains from using its military advantage today in exchange for Iranian disarmament. To make this credible, Tehran must visibly dismantle facilities, physically degrading its own future military capacity. By forcing them to rebuild later, the U.S. successfully lowers Iran's future bargaining ceiling and buys valuable strategic time. The objective is not a utopian solution to proliferation, but to introduce friction, cost, and delay into the adversary's decision loop. We are watching a similar dynamic of coercion and deterrence unfold in real time across the Taiwan Strait. That theater is quietly building toward a missile crisis that mirrors the fading windows of opportunity we see in the Gulf. Both scenarios involve the desperate management of escalation ladders where the margin for error has never been thinner. For the moment, however, the Persian Gulf remains the most volatile flashpoint on the map where American hegemony is being tested. If you want to understand the catastrophic mechanics of a strait closure, watch my deep dive feature on the channel. The naval domain is where the balance of power is most visible, so keep your eyes fixed on the water. We will soon see if Friday's diplomats can silence the guns, or if the USS Abraham Lincoln finally gets the green light. The strategic clock is ticking down. If you found this analysis valuable, please like and subscribe for more coverage.